After Henry, by Simon Brett, read by Prunella. Chapter 1, The Older Man. The only thing wrong with Dr. Henry France was that he was dead. At the age of 46, he had been killed in a car crash. And although no blame for the accident could be attributed to him, his death did cause problems. 3 problems, really: his wife Sarah, his daughter Claire, and his mother-in-law Eleanor. 3 women, all living in the same house when he died, and 2 years later, all still living in the same house, after Henry. Very few people die at the right time, but it often seemed to Sarah France, as it does to many widows, that her husband's death could not have come at a worse moment. The family had moved less than a year before from London to a quieter practice in a country town some 70 miles from the capital. They had bought an ample Edwardian family house with 3 floors and a basement, and Sarah, already slightly bemused by the realization that she had imperceptibly reached 40, was still adjusting to the culture shock of country life. Her daughter, Claire, was at that stage of adolescence when disarming babyishness alternated rapidly with truculence and slamming doors. And perhaps most difficult from Sarah's point of view, Eleanor Prescott had moved into the flat upstairs. Sarah's mother had been widowed some 3 years before the move from London, and it had been Henry France who, with typical magnanimity, had suggested her living under the same roof as the rest of the family. Sarah had had misgivings from the start, but these had been breezed away by Henry's customary charm. "Don't worry, she'll have a separate entrance, be able to live an independent life. We'll hardly see her. Come on, Sarah. Between the 2 of us we can cope with your mother." And between the 2 of them they could. But with Henry suddenly removed from the scene, Sarah didn't find coping so easy. It was not that she did not love her mother, but as in many family relationships, the love was so coloured by memories of past conflicts, blackmails, and compromises that to the casual observer it could at times be mistaken for some other, less respectable emotion. So for 2 years, what with curbing her mother's natural instinct to take over everything and tiptoeing through the minefield of her daughter's adolescence, while at the same time trying to reassemble some kind of new life for herself from the fragments into which Henry's death had broken her old one, Sarah France had had her work cut out. But even though it didn't help in her lowest moments of self-doubt and loneliness, she could recognize that she was better off than many widows. For a start, she was better off financially. Her husband's pension provisions, though not lavish, gave her a cushion against total penury. And also, thank God, she had a job, working in a second-hand bookshop. Not perhaps a great job in terms of career or income, but a great job in that it involved daily contact with the bookshop's owner. Gently gay and incurably curious, her boss Russell offered to Sarah that blessing which so few widows are lucky enough to possess: someone to talk to. In the 2 years since Henry's death, certain family rituals had changed and others vanished. Some had vanished, leaving no trace. Others left voids of pain that could never be ignored. One such was breakfast time. Every morning, for the 21 years of their marriage, Sarah France had cooked Henry the large breakfast which he needed to keep him going through the gastronomically unpredictable day of a GP. And this chore, so often resented while obligatory, was now one of those rituals whose absence caused a daily pang. But things moved on, and a new morning ritual had now established itself. This involved Sarah trying to make Claire have a proper breakfast, and Claire trying to gulp a cup of coffee and be out of the kitchen before her mother came downstairs. On this particular morning, one of those September days whose over-hearty brightness is a reminder of winter's approach, Claire wasn't quick enough. Sarah opened the kitchen door and discovered her daughter dressed in the neat blue suit she would wear to her work at the local building society, standing guiltily by the draining board, a coffee cup at her lips. Sarah tightened her dressing-gown belt firmly round her waist. "Morning. Have you had breakfast?" It was tantamount to an admission. Sarah crossed to open the fridge and took out a plate of bacon rashers. "Must have some breakfast." "Why?" The eternal question. Sarah wondered how many times from the age of 2 onwards Claire had asked that. It must stretch into millions. "Don't like breakfast," her daughter continued. "You need it. You're growing," Sarah asserted automatically. "Hope I'm not. Done quite enough growing, thank you. I don't want to grow any more." A sudden panic born of reading too many Sunday newspaper features struck Sarah. "You're not anorexic, are you?" But a glance at Claire, who had exchanged puppy fat for womanly contours without noticeable loss of weight, showed up the fatuousness of the question. Claire didn't even bother to answer it. "Listen, Mummy, I'm 18, quite old enough to know that I don't like breakfast. All I want in the morning is a cup of coffee." "Not enough for you. You really ought—" "You only ever have coffee," Claire accused. Wearily, Sarah put the plate of bacon down on the kitchen table. Back to the other eternal question of childhood. Why should I have to do something when you don't? Sarah didn't think she'd achieve much with the old "do what I say, not what I do" argument, so she fell back feebly on, "Yes, but that's different." This was rewarded by another predictable "Why?" "It's a logical decision that I have reached. I have come to realize that my metabolism doesn't need anything to eat in the morning." "Exactly what I've come to realize." Claire gave a little triumphant grin. "Hereditary metabolism." "But I didn't realize it till I was 20. Her daughter shrugged. "So you were a late developer?" "No, Claire pressed home her advantage. "You didn't realize it till you left home, until you got away from Granny. I bet she used to force you to have a cooked breakfast every morning." "Yes, she did. Exactly as you were forcing me." Sarah had to admit a logical defeat. She turned away to switch on the coffee machine as Claire continued. "So let's just forget it, shall we? Cut breakfast out of the day. I mean, it made some sense while Daddy was alive." Sarah was obscurely pleased by the reference. Claire usually clammed up to the point of not mentioning her father. For her to bring his name up in any context seemed a kind of advance. "Yes," said Sarah in a voice that she hoped didn't sound wistful. "Henry liked his breakfast. But you don't and I don't, so don't let's pretend. Forget it. And while we're at it, let's forget talking to each other in the morning as well." "Claire, I think that talking to anyone before 9 a.m. is an unnatural act and should be punishable by law." Sarah started to protest, but was overruled. "Go on, Mummy, you agree. We're both dreadful in the morning. Same metabolism again." It was very difficult, Sarah was finding, to conduct an argument when she agreed with most of what her opponent was saying. She grinned. This sparring with Claire was not an unhealthy symptom in their relationship. It was a kind of communication, better at least than when her daughter went silent on her. But Sarah's momentary comfort was briskly removed by Claire taking a final gulp of her coffee and announcing, "Never mind, it'll all be simpler when I move out." Her mother could only echo, "When you move out?" "Yeah, into a flat." "You're planning to move into a flat?" "Yes." Claire swilled the dregs of her coffee into the sink and placed the cup firmly on the draining board. "I must go," she said, sweeping across the kitchen. "But Claire—" Sarah had a "bye" tossed her way as her daughter left the kitchen. "Claire, will you be late?" she called to the closing door. "Yes," came the departing cry from the hall. The coffee was ready. Sarah poured herself a cup and sat down at the kitchen table. The bacon rashers stared up slimily at her. Yuck! Claire was right. The thought of food at that time in the morning was obscene. The bacon went back into the fridge. Sarah returned to her seat and took a sip of coffee. What Claire had said had disturbed her, but it was only a mild disturbance. For a start, it probably meant nothing. "It'll all be simpler when I move out," was the sort of line Claire frequently flung out as a warning shot in the armed truce which was their relationship. And if Claire did mean it, the possibility was not a completely new idea to Sarah. She knew that, even allowing for her daughter's alternating frosts and flare-ups, she had been lucky to have Claire around for the last 2 years, and she knew it was a situation that could not continue forever. Part of the reason they got on each other's nerves so much was that they lived in such close proximity. So it had to end sometime. Sarah tried to curb the selfish maternal desire that that time should be as far away as possible, because apart from anything else, the corollary of Claire's departure would be that Sarah was left with just her mother. She took a long, grateful swallow of coffee and tried to put the thought from her mind. She looked round the kitchen, refitted and decorated when they moved, but now showing the first hints of incipient shabbiness. The wallpaper over the cooker was slightly discoloured. The door on one of the units had slipped marginally out of alignment, so that it had to be lifted in closing to be secure on its magnetic catch. The paintwork at the bottom of the door to the hall was a little chipped, too often kicked shut when Sarah returned laden with shopping. And by the back door there were two small chasms in the wall, where a shelf, fixed by Henry with inadequate roll-plugging, had detached itself the first time any weight was put on it. Little incompetencies like that were much more poignant reminders of her husband than other, grander symbols. And in a way that she knew was perverse and ridiculous, Sarah felt that to block in those holes and decorate over them would be a tiny act of betrayal. But she was not in a maudlin mood, and she was alone. Again she sipped luxuriously at her coffee. In many ways this was the best moment of the day, alone still before the routine demands of living started. The peace couldn't last. There was a creak on the stairs, then a soft padding of footsteps across the hall carpet, and almost before she heard the little finger tap on her kitchen door, Sarah said with resignation, "Come in, Mother." Eleanor Prescott stood in the doorway, dressed and made up for the day. She was not of the generation that believed in slopping around in a dressing gown. She smiled graciously. "Good morning, Sarah, darling." She hesitated as if uncertain. "I wonder if I could—" Sarah, who knew that uncertainty was not a part of her mother's emotional vocabulary, dryly continued the question for her. "Borrow some—" "Yes," said Eleanor, and closed the door, satisfied. But Sarah was determined to play the ritual out. "Some what?" How about milk?" suggested Eleanor. "How about it? Yes, I'm sure you can borrow some." Sarah rose and crossed to the fridge. "Though how you managed to get through 2 pints overnight, I can't imagine." 2 pints, really? Saw them yesterday evening." Sarah stood with her hand on the fridge door and looked back ironically at her mother. "Where?" "In your fridge, Mother, on the milk shelf. But I suppose you didn't think to look there." "No, I didn't, actually." The excuse was so blatant that Sarah couldn't help grinning. "You know, Mother, the idea of that flat upstairs was that it was self-contained." "I know," said Eleanor with an answering grin. "Well, it is, but I'm not." "So I gathered." Sarah relented. "Want some coffee?" But her mother hadn't completed her part of the ritual. "Just came to borrow the milk." "Well, borrow some coffee too, and a mug, and don't bother to take them away." Sarah turned to the coffee machine and heard her mother's voice asking, mock tentative from the doorway, "May I borrow a chair too?" "Sit down." Eleanor Prescott installed herself cosily at the table and looked round with satisfaction. "You had your breakfast then, Sarah?" "Just coffee." "Oh, it's not enough for you. You should—" It only took a look from Sarah to dry up the rest of that particular sentence. They sat opposite each other with their full cups of coffee and took the first swallow in silence. Sarah looked at her watch. Still another 10 minutes before she'd have to start the daily tedium of washing and dressing. There were advantages in working near to home. 10 more minutes. Not quite alone, but at least for the moment in silence. It couldn't last. Eleanor Prescott had the same abhorrence for silence that nature has for a vacuum. "Heard you and Claire having your usual morning banter?" "At least we're talking. She's actually quite perky at the moment, not going through one of her phases of total non-communication." "Confides in you, does she?" asked Eleanor innocently. "To an extent." "What, tells you everything?" Sarah grinned ruefully. "Not to that extent, no." "No," said Eleanor. And in that monosyllable her tone had changed. Its innocence had given way to a kind of slyness of which Sarah's long experience made her instantly aware. "What do you mean? You know something?" "One hears rumours," said her mother demurely. "What?" "Don't know if it's true." But Sarah had known her mother too long to be taken in by this show of diffidence. "Mother, come on, what is it?" It was never Eleanor Prescott's habit to give a direct answer to a question if she could avoid it. Once she was sure of her audience's attention, she preferred to go the pretty way. So, as if embarking on a completely new topic, she said, "Claire's been getting home late a lot recently." "Yes, but, I mean, she finishes at the Building Society at 5:30, and she's never here before 8. Or if she is early, she rushes out again." "Mother, if she—" But Eleanor was not to be deflected from her story or from her chosen manner of telling it.
Not that much to do in this town, I'd have thought. Have you asked her what she does?
No, but I try. If this remark had any relevance to herself, Eleanor chose to ignore it.
Oh, no, nor do I.
She paused.
But when it's your own child, that's different.
She smiled innocently at her daughter.
You mean you do know what she does, then?
Well, I know she sometimes plays badminton with friends, and she has a drink with friends, or... Sarah was annoyed to find herself getting increasingly flustered. She is 18, Mother. She's adult, by law, anyway. It's not my place to follow her it's up to her. I don't care. There was a long silence before Sarah finally had to surrender to her curiosity. What has she been doing? Eleanor rewarded herself with a small smile for having achieved the direct question she'd been fishing for. But once again, her reply was oblique.
Well, Mrs. Johnson from the day centre's grandson, Terry, works behind the bar at the Red Lion.
Sarah said nothing, knowing by bitter experience that Eleanor would make her revelations at her own pace, and that any attempts to hurry her would only have the reverse effect.
And Terry's seen Claire in there more than once in the evenings.
If that was all, Sarah had her response ready. So, she's old enough to drink legally. She often goes out with Gary and the rest of her crowd after work. Claire's very sensible about alcohol, and I don't see why you should make a fuss about her going out for a drink with friends. If
not friends,
said Eleanor, poising her bombshell neatly over its target.
Friend. What do you mean? An older man.
Sarah tried to escape the implications by flippancy.
The same older man each time, or is she working her way through the Bowls Club?
The same one each time.
Ah.
Glowing from the reaction to her initial revelation, Eleanor proceeded to pile on the evidence.
And Sylvia Waits from the Meals on Wheels has seen them together in the White Horse.
Oh,
twice.
Wonder who he is, mused Sarah, setting things up all too easily for her mother.
I know,
Eleanor announced smugly. Of course, she'd never have started the elaborate lead-up if she didn't. Sarah gave in.
All right, who? Margaret Walton's cousin Pauline heard about him from Valerie Brown on the pension.
Muttered, the geriatric grapevine's been working overtime. It was a source of minor but continuing irritation to her that her mother, thrown suddenly in her 70s into a town where she knew no one, had within weeks built up a network of acquaintance far more complex and numerous than Sarah's own. Eleanor did not respond to her daughter's remark. She was too eager to continue her revelation.
He does coaching at the tennis club,
she announced triumphantly.
The older man, he must be fit for his age. Sarah, this is serious. This is Claire we're talking about.
I know. How old exactly is this man?
Well, Valerie Brown on the pension counter's sister Mary's gentleman friend Morris is a groundsman at the tennis club, and he reckons the older man's at least 35.
Said Sarah wistfully. That sounds quite young to me.
But not for Claire.
No, I suppose not. Sarah wanted to be alone. She wanted to work out her own reactions to the news without promptings from her mother. But then, all her life she had wanted to work out her own reactions to things without promptings from her mother. And the next prompt came sharply on its cue.
Well, what are you going to do about it, sir?
She hadn't got the answer to that one ready yet, but she fudged something together. I don't know. It is her life. After all, I'm not going to interfere. Claire can see who she likes, so far as I'm concerned. It's up to her. And she was silent as a new doubt crept into her mind. I wonder why she hasn't told me anything about it. This was an incautiously open invitation to Eleanor, whose memory was a comprehensive card index of precedents from Sarah's own childhood, which could instantly be summoned up, given only a hint of a cue. She immediately had one ready for this occasion.
You never told me when you went to see Jailhouse Rock with that teddy boy, Mick.
Oh, Mother, Sarah growled wearily. How many times do I have to tell you? Mick wasn't a teddy boy. He just borrowed his father's jacket, and it was too big for him.
But you never told me,
Eleanor persisted.
No, right, I didn't tell you. And you know why I didn't tell you? Because, quite frankly, Mother, I knew that if I did, I'd never hear the end of it. I knew you'd just witter on about it till... And you think Claire feels any differently about you?
Yes, she did think so, or she hoped so. But even as she thought it, the awful doubt that Claire might feel exactly about her as she did about her mother sidled into Sarah's mind, draining its small, carefully husbanded store of self-confidence. She tried to bluster her way out. "Mother, even you must admit that you've always been a nosy old bat." Eleanor did not rise to the insult. Instead, she smiled serenely and said, "Sarah, to their daughters, all mothers are nosy old bats. It's just something that goes with the job." As Sarah went through the automatic processes of washing and dressing, she felt slightly troubled by the 2 pieces of information she had received that morning. The fact that Claire wanted to get away from the house and set her own was perhaps saddening, but not unpredictable, nothing to worry about. And the fact that she was seeing an older man in secret was wounding to her mother's self-image as her daughter's confidant. But again, it was fairly natural behaviour in an 18-year-old, again, nothing really to worry about. But if the 2 facts were related, if Claire was planning to move into a flat with her older man, then they did become rather worrying. End of side 1.